above the Brexen-Tal Valley in the Austrian Alps, the medieval walls of Castle Itter stood as a majestic contradiction. To the locals, it was a historic fortress. To the Nazi regime, it was a Sonderlager, a special camp. But to the men trapped inside in early May 1945, it was the Golden Cage. Inside these thick stone walls, the prisoners weren't common soldiers or starving laborers. They were the elite of France. Among them were two former prime ministers, Paul Reynaud and Édouard Daladier, the legendary general Maurice Gamelin, and even a world-famous tennis star, Jean Borotra. They were kept in relative comfort with decent food and private rooms, but the luxury was a thin veil. They were high-value hostages, kept alive as long as they were useful to the crumbling Third Reich. As the final days of the war arrived, the atmosphere inside the Golden Cage turned from boredom to sheer terror. The sounds of Allied artillery rumbled in the distance, but the immediate threat was much closer. The SS guards, led by the brutal Sebastian Wimmer, were becoming increasingly erratic. They knew the end was coming, and orders were circulating from Berlin that no high-profile witnesses should fall into Allied hands alive. The Golden Cage was on the verge of becoming a tomb. On May 4th, the situation reached a breaking point. Commander Wimmer, sensing the imminent arrival of American tanks, suddenly fled the castle with his men. For a brief moment, the French VIPs were free. They broke into the armory, grabbing whatever rifles and pistols the SS had left behind. But their relief was short-lived. The surrounding woods were crawling with Waffen-SS units, fanatical diehards who refused to surrender and were hunting for traitors and escapees. The Frenchmen looked out from the battlements, seeing the black uniforms of the SS moving through the tree line below. They were armed, but they were elderly politicians and retired generals, not a combat squad. They were surrounded by a sea of fanaticism, and they knew that if the SS decided to storm the castle, they wouldn't stand a chance. "We are free," Reynaud remarked grimly, looking at his pistol, "but we have never been in more danger." The Golden Cage had lost its bars, but the tigers were still at the door. They needed a savior, but they didn't know if the Americans would arrive in time, or if they would find an ally in the most unlikely of places. Their only hope lay in a Czech cook named Andres Krobot, who volunteered to ride a bicycle out of the castle through the SS lines in a desperate search for anyone wearing an Allied uniform. The fate of the French elite hung by a thread, trapped in a beautiful fortress that had become a target, waiting for a miracle in the dying hours of the most brutal war in history. The stage was set for the strangest battle of World War II, where the lines between friend and foe were about to vanish forever. In the town of Wurgel, just a few miles from the castle, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and the silence of anticipation. Major Joseph Gangl, a highly decorated officer of the Wehrmacht and a veteran of the brutal Eastern Front, stood in the town square. He wore the Iron Cross, but his heart was no longer with the swastika. He had seen enough of the madness. Gangl had secretly joined the Austrian resistance, and his mission was simple: save his men and protect the town from the vengeful SS units that were burning everything in their retreat. When the Czech cook,
Andreas Krobot, arrived on his bicycle with news of the French prisoners at Castle Itter, Gangl knew he couldn't act alone. He had only a handful of loyal soldiers and an old truck. He needed heavy iron. He needed the Americans. Driven by a strange sense of duty, Gangl climbed into his Kugelwagen, tied a large white bedsheet to a pole, and drove toward the American lines. Near the village of Kufstein, he encountered a reconnaissance unit of the 12th Armored Division. At the head of the column was Captain Jack Lee, a cigar-chomping, tough-as-nails tanker from New York. The scene was surreal. A decorated German major, still in full uniform, stepped out of his vehicle with his hands raised, not to surrender, but to negotiate. Through a translator, Gangl explained the situation. High-ranking French prisoners are about to be slaughtered by the SS. I have the men, but I need your tanks. Captain Lee didn't hesitate. He was a man who preferred action over paperwork. He didn't check with his superiors. He didn't wait for orders. He looked at the German officer, his sworn enemy until 5 minutes ago, and saw a soldier who was telling the truth. "All right, Major," Lee said, flicking his cigar ash. "Let's go save some Frenchmen." Lee volunteered his own tank, an M4 Sherman, nicknamed Besotten Jenny. But the mission was a suicide run. The bridge leading to the castle was weak, and the roads were narrow and winding. Lee could only take a skeleton crew, 14 American GIs, Gangl, and 10 of Gangl's own German artillerymen. As Besotten Jenny rolled up the steep wooded path toward the castle gates, the captain and the major checked their weapons. The SS were watching from the trees, and the strangest battle of World War II was about to begin in earnest.
As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Austrian Alps, the heavy iron gates of Castle Itter groaned open. The French prisoners, standing on the ramparts with rifles they barely knew how to use, peered down in disbelief. Emerging from the forest mist was a sight that seemed like a fever dream, a single American Sherman tank, its engine roaring, followed by a German truck filled with soldiers in Wehrmacht gray. Captain Jack Lee jumped down from the turret of Besotten Jenny, his movements sharp and his face covered in the dust of the road. Beside him stood Major Gangl, the German officer who had risked an executioner's noose to bring this rescue party. This was the Suicide Squad, a tiny, mismatched force of 20-odd men tasked with holding a medieval fortress against an entire regiment of fanatical Waffen-SS. The atmosphere inside the castle was a bizarre mix of celebration and extreme tension. The French elite, former prime ministers and world-class athletes rushed to greet Lee, offering him wine and gratitude. But Lee, ever the realist, brushed the pleasantries aside. He didn't see a palace, he saw a tactical nightmare. The castle sat on a knoll surrounded by dense woods, providing perfect cover for the SS snipers already taking positions. "Major," Lee barked, pointing to the main gate, "we're turning that Sherman into a stationary bunker." Under Lee and Gangl's joint command, the Americans and Germans began to work side by side. It was a surreal mechanical ballet. A GI from New York and a soldier from Bavaria hauled crates of ammunition together. They spent the night sandbagging the lower windows and setting up machine gun nests on the stone balconies. Lee placed the Sherman right at the entrance, its 75mm gun pointing down the only road. But the Suicide Squad was desperately thin. To cover the entire perimeter, Lee had to make a decision that violated every military protocol. He armed the French civilians.
He gave pistols and submachine guns to the aging politicians, telling them that if the walls were breached, they were the last line of defense. Throughout the night, the silence of the mountains was punctured by the terrifying crack of SS rifles from the tree line. The enemy was testing them, probing for weaknesses. The SS 17th Panzer Grenadier Division had surrounded the knoll with nearly 150 men and anti-tank guns. They weren't just looking for a fight, they were looking to erase the traitors inside. Inside the damp stone halls, the American and German soldiers shared coffee and cigarettes in the dark. They couldn't speak each other's language, but they shared the same heavy realization. They were vastly outnumbered, low on ammunition, and cut off from any immediate reinforcements. Major Gangel looked at his men, then at Lee, and gave a grim nod. They were no longer representatives of two warring nations. They were a single unit, a brotherhood of the desperate, waiting for a dawn that many of them would not live to see. As the first gray light of May 5th touched the castle towers, the first 88mm shell screamed through the air, exploding against the upper masonry. The suicide squad grabbed their weapons. The siege had begun, and the strangest alliance in history was about to be baptized in fire. The morning of May 5th, 1945, did not bring the peace the world was celebrating. It brought a symphony of destruction to the walls of Castle Itter. As the sun rose over the Tyrolean peaks, the fanatical Waffen-SS launched a full-scale assault. Their objective was clear: liquidate the traitors and the high-profile French prisoners before the main American force could arrive. The siege of Itter began with a deafening roar. An SS 88mm anti-tank gun hidden in the tree line found its mark. The shells screamed through the air and slammed into the American Sherman tank Besotten Jenny, which was guarding the main gate. The explosion was massive, turning the Iron Giant into a flaming wreck. Captain Jack Lee and his crew barely scrambled out in time, retreating into the stone fortress as machine gun fire peppered the ground at their heels. Inside the castle, the scene was unlike anything ever recorded in military history. On the ramparts, American GIs in olive drab stood shoulder to shoulder with German Wehrmacht soldiers in field gray. They shared ammunition, swapped magazines, and shouted warnings to one another over the din of battle. Beside them, the French VIPs, former prime ministers and generals, refused to hide in the cellar. Paul Reynaud, the former leader of France, grabbed a submachine gun and stood at a window, firing alongside the men who had been his jailers just days before. The SS infantry began to swarm up the slopes, using the dense woods for cover. They were hardened combatants, equipped with Panzerfausts and MG-42s. The defenders were low on ammunition and even lower on hope. Captain Lee moved from position to position, his cigar long gone, replaced by the grim determination of a man facing his final stand. He knew they were being squeezed into a smaller and smaller perimeter. Then, tragedy struck the heart of the alliance. Major Josef Gangel, the German officer who had bridged the gap between enemies to save the prisoners, saw former French Prime Minister Reynaud exposed at an open window. A sniper's bullet was aimed at the Frenchman's head. Without a moment's hesitation, Gangel lunged forward, pushing Reynaud out of the line of fire. In that selfless act of courage, a German sniper's bullet found Gangel instead. The major died instantly on the cold stone floor of the castle, a German hero who gave his life to save a French leader and an American mission. As the afternoon wore on, the situation turned desperate. The SS had reached the lower walls and were preparing to blow the main gate. Captain Lee realized they were down to their last few belts of ammunition. In a final daring move, the French tennis star Jean Borotra volunteered to go on a suicide run. He leapt over the castle wall, sprinted through the SS-infested woods, and disappeared into the trees, hoping to find the 142nd Infantry Regiment he knew was nearby. The defenders retreated to the keep, the very last defensive position. They could hear the SS soldiers shouting in the courtyard below. The strangest alliance in history was down to its final bullets. They looked at one another, American, German, and French, knowing they had fought a good fight, a clean fight, in the middle of a dirty war. They braced for the end, fixed their bayonets, and waited for the final breach, unaware that the sound of distant American sirens was finally echoing through the valley.
The sun was high in the sky, but for the defenders of Castle Itter, the world was turning black. The stone walls that had stood for centuries were crumbling under the relentless pounding of SS shells. Inside the keep, the air was thick with the smell of spent gunpowder and the heavy breath of exhausted men. Captain Jack Lee looked at his half-empty magazine, then at the German soldiers beside him. They were down to their last rounds. The SS were already in the lower courtyard, their boots crunching on the gravel, their voices echoing with the chilling confidence of those who know victory is minutes away. Just as the SS prepared to launch their final, decisive breach of the keep, the heavy thud of distant artillery shook the valley. But this wasn't the light crack of a German 88. It was the deep, earth-shaking boom of the American 142nd Infantry Regiment's heavy guns. Suddenly, the woods to the west erupted. The tennis star Jean Baratra had made it. Through sheer athletic grit, he had sprinted through a gauntlet of snipers to reach the American relief column. Now the cavalry had arrived. M10 tank destroyers and columns of American infantry tore through the SS lines like a hot knife through butter. The fanatical besiegers, caught between the castle walls and the incoming American steel, were shattered. Within minutes, the terrifying pressure on the castle vanished. The SS hunters became the hunted, scattering into the Tyrolean forests or throwing down their weapons in surrender. The gates of Castle Itter were thrown open once more, but this time it wasn't a suicide squad entering, it was a wave of fresh American troops. The relief force stood frozen for a moment as they entered the courtyard. They saw a sight that defied every law of the war they had been fighting for years. They saw American GIs, their faces blackened with soot, sitting on the ground and sharing water with Wehrmacht soldiers. They saw French politicians, men who had shaped the destiny of Europe, hugging dusty tankers from Texas. And they saw the body of Major Joseph Gangel, draped in a simple cloth, honored by both the men he had once fought and the men he had died to save. The aftermath was as surreal as the battle itself. Captain Jack Lee, still clutching his Thompson submachine gun, met the commander of the relief force. His first words weren't about glory or medals. He simply looked at the wreckage of his tank, besotted Jenny, and asked for a cigarette. The German soldiers who had fought alongside the Americans were treated with a strange, quiet respect. While they were technically prisoners of war, they weren't marched off at bayonet point. They had earned a different kind of status. For one day, in one small corner of Austria, the labels of Nazi and Allied had been replaced by something older and deeper, the code of the soldier and the instinct of the protector. The Battle of Castle Itter remains the only time in the entire conflict where Americans and Germans fought as brothers in arms. As the French VIPs were driven away to safety and the survivors were processed, the legend of the strange victory was born. It was a reminder that even in the final dying breaths of a global slaughter, humanity could find a way to bridge the widest of chasms. Major Gangel was later buried with full honors and remains a hero in Austria to this day. Captain Lee received the Distinguished Service Cross, but for the men who stood on those ramparts, the true reward was the silence that followed the battle, a silence that signaled not just the end of the siege, but the end of the nightmare.
The cavalry had arrived, the golden cage was empty, and the strangest alliance in history had proven that even enemies can find common ground when the cause is just.